The ringing cut through the dark like a sharp blade, pulling me out of sleep before I could understand what was happening. My hand fumbled across the nightstand until I found the phone, the cold screen glowing against my palm. It was 2:17 a.m., a time no one calls unless something is wrong. I answered with my voice still rough from sleep, and the moment I heard the tone on the other end, the air in my chest tightened. The agent spoke calmly, too calmly for the hour. "Sir, someone tried accessing your safe last night." The words landed clean and heavy, clearing the last traces of sleep from my mind. I sat upright, letting my feet touch the cold floor as a slow unease spread through me. I'm in my late 60s, and although stress has made me misplace a few things here and there, my memory is still sharp where it matters. I always remember what needs to be locked away. I always remember what the safe holds, documents tied to the property, letters my late wife wrote, and the ring she wanted passed down someday. I rose quietly and moved toward the door, the house still thick with night. The hallway was dim, but the faintest glow came from the guest room. I stopped at the open doorway and looked in. My grandson lay sprawled across the bed, one arm hanging over the edge, breathing slow and steady. He'd come to stay with me weeks ago, saying he needed a break from everything going on with school and life. I never questioned it. Family doesn't always come with explanations. I watched him for a moment, noting the peaceful rise and fall of his chest, then stepped back into the silent hallway. When I reached the study, the air felt different, heavier, as if it had held something long before I entered. The safe sat tucked in the corner, a solid piece of steel I had trusted for years. I knelt down and brushed my fingers along the keypad. 3 red lights blinked back at me in slow succession. 3 failed attempts. Someone had stood right here, in the middle of the night, entering codes they shouldn't have known. I placed my hand against the cool metal door and felt a faint pulse of tension push up my arm. The agent on the phone had mentioned the attempts happened last night, but the system had registered them barely an hour earlier. I wiped my thumb across the edge of the keypad, noticing a thin smear where someone might have pressed too hard. The safe wasn't scratched or forced. It was tested quietly by someone who believed they had time. I stood up and let my eyes adjust to the faint shadows, searching for anything else out of place. A chair sat slightly off-center, not where I'd left it. A corner of a rug curled up as if stepped on. These were small details, but I've lived long enough to understand that danger rarely comes in loud announcements. It starts with subtle shifts, little movements meant to go unnoticed. I turned toward the hallway again, listening to the silence stretch across the house. As I did, a soft sound came from the guest room, a shift of bed sheets, a faint sigh, the creak of the mattress. My grandson stirred at the exact moment I stepped away from the safe. Not fully awake, not alert, just enough movement to make the quiet feel heavier. I didn't call out to him. I didn't ask anything. I simply stood there until the stillness settled again. There was no accusation in my mind, just a slow, widening question that settled deep in my chest. Someone had tried to open my safe. Someone who knew the house. Someone comfortable enough to move in the dark. I turned off the study light and walked back into the hallway, carrying the weight of that thought with every step. The house felt different in the morning, as if the night had left a thin layer of unease settled over every surface. I stood at the kitchen counter, waiting for the coffee to finish brewing, listening to the slow drip that had become part of my morning rhythm. My grandson wandered in a few minutes later, rubbing sleep from his eyes, greeting me with a casual, "Morning, Grandpa," as though the night had passed without incident. I watched him move around the kitchen, comfortable, familiar, and a quiet memory surfaced, uninvited but clear. I raised him through years that weren't easy on either of us. His parents had fallen apart early, leaving the boy adrift at a time when he needed stability most. I stepped in because someone had to, because a child shouldn't carry the weight of adult mistakes. He spent most of his childhood in this house, at this table, learning routines that kept him grounded. Those years weren't perfect, but they shaped him, and they tied him to me in ways I never thought would be tested. He sat across from me now, sipping from a mug he always used when he was younger. "Hey," he said casually, "remember those financial worksheets I told you about? The ones for my business class?" He waited until I looked at him before continuing. "I might need some more details later, like how you manage your accounts and stuff. Teachers want real examples." I nodded, but the request tugged at something in me. Weeks earlier, he'd asked similar question, saying it was just for school. I'd answered what felt safe in general, but his interest had grown in ways I hadn't fully understood. The more I watched him, the more I noticed slight changes. New clothes, a phone he hadn't mentioned buying, the way he stepped outside to take calls he labeled as nothing important. The shifts were subtle, but I'd lived long enough to know subtle changes often carry quiet meaning. Over breakfast, he mentioned his girlfriend, saying she might stop by later. I'd met her twice. Both times she wore the type of pleasant smile that doesn't quite reach the eyes. She was polite, charming even, but something about her never settled right. She avoided details about herself, brushed off simple questions, and seemed overly interested in the layout of the house. Last time she visited, she asked to use the restroom but stayed near the study door a little too long. I remembered that moment with a sharper clarity now. After my wife passed, I learned to read people differently. Grief strips away the softness you once relied on. It teaches you to notice patterns, shifts in tone, the tiniest inconsistencies. My wife used to say I was too trusting, too patient with those who didn't deserve it. Losing her made me see the truth behind that. Now, when something feels off, I listen. Later in the morning, as we sat in the living room, my grandson leaned forward and said lightly, "You know, Grandpa, if handling bills or banking gets stressful, I can take over some of it, just to give you a break." He said it kindly, but there was a flicker in his eyes, one I hadn't seen before. It wasn't concern, it was interest. That was the first moment a real doubt settled inside me. Small but firm. Something wasn't aligning the way it once did. By afternoon, conversations around town drifted into my mind. Rumors about property investors targeting older homeowners, offering quick deals and faster pressure. I dismissed them before, but now they lingered. My land had value to the right buyer, more value than my grandson likely understood, unless someone had started explaining it to him. I watched him leave the room, phone in hand, voice low as he spoke to someone I couldn't hear. The unease deepened, filling the spaces grief had once occupied. Something was shifting in this house again, and this time, it wasn't just memory or age whispering for my attention. The morning after the call, the house felt too still, the kind of stillness that makes sound carry farther than it should. My grandson stepped into the kitchen with a brightness that felt almost rehearsed. He stretched his arms and yawned loudly. "Slept all night," he said, rubbing his eyes. "Didn't hear a thing." I nodded, but the words didn't match what I'd heard the night before. The soft creak of footsteps outside my bedroom around 1:45 a.m. I had dismissed it as pipes or settling wood at the time. Now it became something else in my mind, something I held onto quietly. Later in the day, his girlfriend stepped through the front door with a warm smile, acting as though she hadn't seen me in weeks. She placed her bag on the table and slipped into conversation with an ease that felt too smooth. At one point she said, "I wasn't here last night, so I hope everything's okay." Her tone was casual, a little too casual. I looked toward the armchair by the window. Draped over the back was a jacket I hadn't seen before. Hers, the same one she wore the last time she visited. She didn't seem to notice it there, or she hoped I wouldn't. I didn't confront her. I didn't ask why the jacket was still in my house if she never came over. Instead, I walked past it slowly, letting my fingers brush the fabric for just a moment. It held the faint scent of her perfume. That was enough to confirm a small crack in the story they were trying to build. In the study, I checked the safe again. The keypad lights had reset, but as I stepped back, a small square of yellow caught my eye. A sticky note lay partly tucked under the rug edge near the safe. I bent down and picked it up. 3 numbers were written on it, shakily, as if someone wrote them quickly in dim light. It wasn't a full code. It wasn't my handwriting. It was a clue, small, accidental, but enough to say someone had been testing numbers they only half remembered. When I returned to the living room, my grandson greeted me with a level of enthusiasm I hadn't seen since he was a child. He sat beside me, leaning forward with sudden interest in my routines, my hobbies, even my old stories. "We should spend more time together," he said. "Maybe pick a night each week to bond more." His smile stayed wide and stiff, as if held in place by something other than affection. I listened, answering simply, watching the way his knee bounced the entire time he spoke. I let my face soften, let my voice slow, let myself appear unsure in a way that didn't look forced. I asked him to repeat simple things, pretended to forget a detail or two, just long enough to see whether his eyes brightened at the idea. They did. Subtle, but visible. He watched me too closely, as if assessing whether the foundation beneath me was shifting. Before he left the room, he paused and asked, "Is the safe still working normally?" I looked up, feigning confusion. "Why?" I asked. He shrugged quickly, a gesture too quick to be natural. "Just wondering. You know, old things break sometimes." He walked off before I could respond. But 10 minutes later, he came back and asked the same question again, trying to sound casual. "Safe all good?" he said lightly. "Didn't want it to glitch on you." The repetition wasn't concern. It was checking progress. Checking whether I'd discovered anything. Checking whether I suspected anything. I answered slowly, matching the tone I wanted him to see. "Seems fine," I said. Inside, the suspicion grew stronger, not sharp enough to confront, but too solid to ignore. The pieces weren't lining up, and the silence between them felt louder every hour. I waited until the house settled into its slow afternoon rhythm before I opened the security app on my phone. The indoor hallway camera had recorded all night, silent and patient, and I scrolled back to the early hours with a steady hand. When the timestamp hit 1:42 a.m., the footage shifted from empty hallway to movement, slow, cautious, and deliberate. A figure stepped into frame wearing a dark hoodie, the hood pulled just enough to blur the face. I leaned closer, replaying the clip twice. The height, the build, the slight curve in the shoulders. I didn't want the recognition, but it came anyway. It matched my grandson. He moved with a stiffness that didn't belong to someone simply walking to get water or check something. He paused at the edge of the hallway, glancing toward the study as if measuring the distance or the sound of his own breathing. Then he took 3 small steps forward before the camera cut to another angle. I watched carefully, eyes narrowed, not letting emotion get ahead of what I needed to see. As I shifted to the next clip, something else flickered at the bottom of the screen. A second shape, barely visible. A smaller figure stood at the far end of the hallway, just outside the main camera's reach. It appeared for less than a second, the outline faint but unmistakably human. The subtle tilt of the head, the narrow frame, it matched the girlfriend's silhouette the last time she wandered near the study. The footage didn't show her face, but it didn't need to. I paused the video and held the phone still, letting the truth settle. They hadn't just been moving around the house. They had been working together, careful enough to hide in shadows, but not careful enough to escape the lens entirely. I set the phone down and walked to the study, my footsteps measured, breathing calm. The safe stood silent in its corner, untouched now, but still holding the weight of the night. This time, instead of looking at the keypad, I crouched lower and examined the small manual override key slot near the base. The metal around it had faint scratches, thin but fresh, catching the light in sharp lines. Someone had tried a key or a tool, pressing harder than they should have. I ran my finger lightly across the marks, feeling the uneven texture. That wasn't accidental. I straightened slowly, letting my eyes travel across the rest of the room. Nothing else seemed disturbed, but that didn't comfort me. They weren't searching through drawers. They were targeting something specific. Back at the desk, I opened a notebook and wrote down the timestamp, the type of movement, the appearance of the second figure, and the condition of the safe. The writing steadied my pulse. I added notes about the earlier lies and the sticky note near the rug. Each detail I recorded felt like placing a weight on a scale that had been tipping without my permission. I kept my handwriting clear and precise. I wasn't preparing accusations. I was preparing clarity. Clarity for myself, for whatever might come next, and for anyone who might need to understand what happened in this house. Before closing the notebook, I added one more line. 1:42 a.m. 2 figures. I closed it gently, careful not to disturb anything else. There was no panic in me, no urge to confront or demand answers. Not yet. Confrontation only works when the facts are lined up cleanly. I still needed more. I glanced toward the hallway camera feed once more, watching the empty frame as the house returned to quiet. There was calm on the surface, but I could feel the thin undercurrent of tension running through the walls. Something had started in this house at 1:42 a.m., and I wasn't done uncovering it. I opened the safe with the same code I'd used for years, steadying my breath as the door released with its usual heavy click. The interior light flickered on, casting a pale glow across the shelves. At first glance, everything looked untouched, but the longer I stared, the more a hollow feeling grew in my chest. I reached for the top shelf where I always kept the deed for the old property, the one piece of land my wife and I fought to hold on to through every hard season of our lives. My hand touched the empty space before my eyes registered it. The folder wasn't there. I pulled the shelf out slightly, checking behind the other documents, pushing aside envelopes and small boxes. Nothing. The deed, the original, irreplaceable copy, was gone. I stood completely still, letting the realization settle without forcing meaning on it too quickly. The missing folder wasn't an accident. Someone opened this safe at night. Someone tried the wrong code 3 times. Someone knew exactly which document mattered most. I stepped back and opened my laptop, replaying the early morning's tension in my mind with sharper clarity. As the screen unlocked, a notification popped up from the browser. My grandson's profile was still logged in. I hadn't touched his settings since he started staying here, never needed to. But a search history window sat open on the recent activity tab, half minimized. I clicked it, almost afraid to see what waited on the other side. A list appeared. One line stood out like a warning bell. How to transfer property ownership quickly without both signatures. My hand froze on the trackpad. Another line below it. Easiest way to sign for elderly family members. Not advice, not research, intent. I closed the laptop slowly, letting my breath settle into something colder. A whisper of paper caught my attention near the small trash bin beside the desk. I knelt and pushed aside a few crumpled receipts until I found a ball of tighter, white sheets. I smoothed them out carefully. My name sat at the bottom of each page. Shaky, uncertain versions of my signature. Letters too tall, lines too jagged. Attempts, one after another, copying something they thought would fool a clerk. I held them in my hand, feeling the soft tremble in my fingers, not from fear, but from the raw clarity of betrayal. When I stepped into the hallway, the girlfriend's voice floated from the kitchen, low but clear enough to catch the edges of meaning. Once it's transferred, he won't care. She said it lightly, as if discussing a late bill or a small inconvenience. My grandson didn't reply, but the silence between them was thick with agreement. They didn't know I was near the doorway. They didn't know I'd already seen everything they hoped I'd miss. I moved back before they noticed me, leaning against the wall until their footsteps faded. A heaviness pressed against my ribs. Not the weight of age, but the weight of understanding how they planned to use it. My memory lapses were real, but small, ordinary stress, nothing more. But to them, it was an opening, a weakness to lean on, a way to push me into signing something I didn't intend to sign, a way to take what wasn't theirs under the excuse that I wouldn't remember anyway. The anger inside me didn't flare. It settled deep, becoming something sharper and quieter. Not rage, not shock, just the steady awareness that the next move had to be mine. They weren't acting out of confusion. They were acting out of opportunity, and opportunity grows teeth when no one stops it. I returned to the study, closed the safe gently, and locked it with a calm, deliberate press of each number. The house felt colder now, not because of the temperature, but because I knew what I was standing inside of. A plan already in motion, a danger already forming. If I didn't act soon, the next door that locked might be one I couldn't reopen. I drove across town with the missing deed echoing in my mind like a steady pulse. The morning sun hadn't warmed the air yet, and the quiet streets felt sharper than usual. My former estate attorney lived in a brick house near the courthouse, the same one he'd used back when my wife and I first organized our affairs. He opened the door before I knocked twice, studying my face with the same careful eyes he used years ago. "Come in," he said simply, and I followed him to his study, the room where he'd once taught me the difference between caution and paranoia. I set the printed camera footage on the table first, then the attempted signatures, then the notes I had taken in my notebook. He read everything without rushing, his glasses low on his nose, fingers tracing lines the way a man studies a map before judging the terrain. When he finally leaned back, he exhaled through his nose, not with surprise, but with recognition of something he had seen too many times. "This is a coordinated attempt to seize your assets," he said. The words were steady, direct and free of any softening. He knew better than to dress the truth. I watched him pick up the forged signatures again. He held one sheet up to the light and pointed out the uneven pressure in the strokes, the hesitation in the start of each letter. "Someone practiced this," he said. "Someone young, someone impatient." He didn't need to name my grandson. The evidence already had. I handed him the list of recent searches from the laptop. He scanned them quickly, expression tightening just slightly. "They're building a template," he said, piecing together the process before moving. He reached for a folder on his shelf and opened it between us. Inside were copies of the property agreement I had signed years ago. He flipped to a section marked with a yellow tab and laid the original wording beside the altered draft I had found. Even to me, the difference felt small, but he pointed to the lines where the rights shifted entirely to a single name, my grandson's, under the guise of simplifying estate matters. "This," he said, tapping the altered paragraph, "is the proof." He explained the timeline in the same measured tone he used when preparing clients for hard truths. If my grandson submitted a transfer request or filed new documents at the courthouse, the process could move quickly, much faster than most people expected. Undoing it would require hearings, evaluations, and a demonstration of intent that older men often struggled to prove, even with evidence. The system protected property, but it didn't always protect timing. I sat quietly, letting the weight of each detail settle. It wasn't fear that moved through me. It was the clarity that comes when all pieces finally line up. My grandson hadn't acted on impulse. He had planned. He had studied. He had chosen a path he believed I wouldn't see until it was too late. The attorney closed the folder and pulled out a fresh set of documents. "You're at the point of no return now," he said. "If you stall them and avoid signing anything, I can file counter documents to lock your assets in place." He wrote down a list of steps in clean handwriting. Call him before any conversation, delay every request, and avoid being alone with any paperwork. "Your job is simple," he said. "Don't sign, not a single page." I nodded slowly, absorbing every instruction. There was no drama between us, no emotional exchange, just the shared understanding that the ground beneath me had shifted, and the time to act was now. He handed me the protective filings, each page crisp and ready. I placed them carefully into my folder, feeling the steadiness return to my hands. "You're not alone in this," he said. And for the first time since the night the call came, I believed it. By the time evening settled over the house, the air inside carried a tension I hadn't felt in years. Tight, watchful, almost waiting to be broken. I was sitting at the dining table when my grandson walked in with a stack of papers held too carefully in his hands. He placed them down with a firmness that didn't match his rehearsed smile. "We need to finish some important paperwork tonight," he said. The words were dressed as responsibility, but the edge behind them was pressure, plain and thinly masked. His voice wavered just enough to show how badly he needed this moment to go his way. His girlfriend stepped out from the hallway a beat later, arms folded, irritation written across her face. She didn't bother hiding it anymore. "This shouldn't take long if he actually focuses," she muttered. "He's getting too old to keep up with things." She said it under her breath, but not quietly enough to pretend it wasn't meant for me. Her impatience wasn't surprising. People lose their filter when plans fall behind schedule. I didn't react. I simply nodded, keeping my movements slow and unbothered. While they hovered over the papers, whispering to each other about where I should sign, I reached for my phone and sent 2 simple messages. The first to my attorney, "They're pushing tonight." The second to my neighbor, Mrs. Crane, "Stay near your window." Neither replied with questions. They didn't need details. My attorney immediately began preparing the emergency protective filings he had promised, and Mrs. Crane was the kind of woman who could sense danger simply by how a person breathed. When I set the phone down, I let my hand shake slightly, an act I allowed them to see. They mistook it for weakness. My grandson's shoulders relaxed as he took it as a sign that I might fold. "Let's just get this done," he said, pacing behind his chair. His steps were sharp, restless, tapping against the floor in uneven bursts. The cracks in him were widening, the kind that show when someone feels their plan slipping through their fingers. His hands trembled when he picked up the pen, and he kept wiping them on his jeans as if that would steady them. His girlfriend leaned against the counter, watching me with an intensity that bordered on desperation. She whispered something to him, but he waved her off, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the papers. The room felt smaller with each passing minute, as if the walls were drawing closer around the lie they were both trying to keep upright. He paced again, this time rubbing his forehead. "We can't drag this out," he said, voice cracking. "This needs to be done tonight." I kept my gaze steady, letting him believe I was weighing the decision. In truth, I was preparing, not physically, but mentally, going over every instruction the attorney gave me, every detail I had documented, every step that had led to this moment. I inhaled slowly and allowed my expression to soften into uncertainty. Letting them think I was pliable was the safest position I could take right now. My grandson sat down across from me, leaning forward with both hands flat on the table. His breathing was uneven, his eyes too wide. This wasn't confidence. It was fear wrapped in urgency. His girlfriend's impatience only sharpened the edges of it. She kept glancing toward the door as if expecting someone to interrupt the moment they were trying to force. I folded my hands together and rested them on the table. I didn't challenge them. I didn't question them. I just waited, letting the storm gather around us, while my own thoughts settled into a steady line. The confrontation was coming. The truth was close enough to taste. But this moment wasn't about meeting it head-on yet. It was about staying still long enough for everything to crack open by its own pressure. I sat quietly, giving nothing away. Inside, I was ready. My grandson set the papers aside and stood abruptly, as if a decision had snapped into place in his mind. He pointed toward the study with a shaky hand. "Let's just go open the safe," he said. "There's a malfunction or something. I need to check it before anything gets messed up." His tone was forceful, far too forceful for something as simple as a malfunction. He didn't wait for my response. He started walking toward the study, expecting me to follow like a man who still believed he held control. I walked behind him at a steady pace, my heartbeat calm, my breath even. In the study, he turned toward me with a nervous smile stretched too tight. "Okay," he said. "Open it. We'll fix the code issue now." He gestured toward the keypad but didn't meet my eyes. I stood in front of the safe and rested my hand on top of it. "There's no malfunction," I said quietly, "but someone did try to open it." His reaction was immediate. A sharp inhale, a step back. "What? No, that's not, maybe you just forgot entering the wrong—" He stopped mid-sentence, realizing the lie contradicted itself. He tried again. "I wasn't even near this room last night." Another contradiction. Too fast, too clumsy. His eyes darted toward the doorway, toward escape, toward anything that might help him rebuild control. Before he could speak again, the doorbell rang once. Firm, timed, intentional. His shoulders tightened. We both knew who it was. I didn't move. The door opened seconds later. My attorney stepped inside with a folder tucked under one arm, followed by my neighbor, Mrs. Crane, who carried her tablet pressed against her chest. They walked into the study with a quiet authority that filled the room. My grandson froze, unable to hide the tremor running through his hands. The attorney placed the folder onto the desk and opened it without speaking. Inside were printed images, still frames from the hallway camera. One by one, he spread them out across the wood surface. My grandson stared at them with wide, darting eyes. The hoodie, the posture, the timestamp, the second figure just at the frame's edge. Each photo stripped away another layer of denial. His girlfriend lingered near the doorway, her face turning pale. Mrs. Crane held up her tablet and tapped the screen. The short hallway video clip played. Silent, grainy, undeniable. It showed him moving toward the study in the dark, the girlfriend's silhouette appearing behind him, the angle catching just enough detail for certainty. My grandson's breath hitched. He stepped back again, bumping into the bookshelf. His girlfriend reached for her purse, easing one step toward the exit. Mrs. Crane stepped in front of her calmly, not with force, just presence. "You stay," she said. No anger, no theatrics, just a steady boundary she wasn't willing to let them cross. The attorney placed the final piece of evidence on the desk, the forged signature drafts I had found in the trash. He didn't explain them. He didn't need to. They sat beside the images like a confession carved onto paper. My grandson's face crumbled. His hands came up to cover his mouth as his shoulders sagged. He tried to speak, but no words formed. The weight of the evidence pressed down hard, pulling the last strands of denial out of him. He sank into the chair slowly, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor as his breathing broke into small, uneven bursts. His girlfriend stood frozen, eyes glossy with fear, her plans unraveling with every second. No one raised a voice. No one shouted. The truth sat between us, quiet and solid, the only sound in the room and the faint hum of the hallway camera still recording. My grandson looked up at me for the first time, eyes red, face stripped of every mask he had tried to hold. And in that moment, he understood there was nowhere left to hide. The days after the confrontation moved quietly, each one beginning with a phone call from my attorney as he worked to secure the protections I needed. By the end of the week, He had filed an injunction that froze every path my grandson could have used to transfer or claim anything tied to my name. The court accepted it swiftly, stamping the order with the kind of finality that leaves little room for misinterpretation. He handed me a copy, the thick paper still warm from the clerk's machine. "This holds everything in place," he said. "He can't file, sell, or shift a thing." I nodded, feeling the relief run through me in a slow, steady wave. The process that followed was painfully procedural, each step reducing the situation to forms, statements, and dates. My grandson was served with charges: attempted fraud, unlawful access, and forging a legal signature. They were written plainly on the documents, without emotion, just facts laid out in neat rows. He didn't fight them. He didn't have room to. The footage, the notes, the fingerprints on the safe, it all told a story he couldn't twist back into innocence. His girlfriend faced her own set of charges. Aiding an attempted collusion, the officer explained when he handed me a copy of her notice. She had tried to hide behind the idea that she was merely present, but presence matters when someone helps shape the plan. She stopped coming near the house after that. The silence from both of them fell heavy, but it was a silence that belonged to consequence, not regret. When the court date arrived, I dressed slowly, steadying myself more than preparing for anything dramatic. My neighbor, Mrs. Crane, arrived at my door with a gentle knock. "I'll drive," she said. I didn't argue. The attorney met us at the courthouse entrance, standing with that familiar posture, firm, unshaken, reliable. The three of us walked in together, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was entering a place alone. The courtroom felt colder than I expected, the kind of cold that sinks into the floor and rises through your shoes. I took a seat in the first row behind the prosecution's table, hands clasped, breathing. Even when the bailiff brought my grandson in, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not even disappointment, just a deep, quiet sadness. He looked smaller than I remembered, younger. He didn't meet my eyes. His shoulders were slumped, and his hands were trembling slightly, though he tried to hide it by clasping them too tightly together. The judge read the charges in a steady voice, each word landing like a stone in water. There was no drama, no raised tones, just the plain recitation of choices that had led us here. His girlfriend sat beside her lawyer, jaw tight, gaze locked somewhere far beyond the walls of the room. She didn't look at me either. The attorney leaned slightly toward me during a short recess. "This is the system doing what it's made to do," he said quietly. "You protected yourself." I nodded, but my chest felt heavy all the same. Protection was necessary, but it didn't mend the fracture that ran through my family now. When the hearing ended, the room emptied slowly. I remained seated, letting my thoughts settle into something I could carry without breaking under the weight. Mrs. Crane placed a hand on my shoulder, her voice soft but firm. "Trust shouldn't be taken. It should be earned," she said. There was no judgment in her tone, just truth offered gently to a man who had learned it the hard way. We walked out of the courthouse together, the sun stretching across the pavement, warming the cold that had followed me inside. The legal part was over, but the emotional weight lingered behind my ribs like a bruise. Vindication came through paperwork, but the real wound came from the quiet place where trust used to live. In the weeks after the court hearing, the house finally settled back into its natural quiet, the kind that didn't feel watchful or heavy anymore. I spent a full afternoon walking room to room, updating every piece of security that mattered. New passwords, new locks, a new safe drilled into the foundation instead of the wall. The security company installed a second camera by the study door, and I added motion alerts that sent notifications directly to my phone. None of it felt paranoid. It felt responsible, the way a man protects the life he built with steady hands and earned years. My attorney visited twice, bringing folders with new legal safeguards written in plain, solid language. This time, everything had witnesses, backups, and clauses that left no room for anyone to slip in through confusion or misplaced trust. We organized the documents carefully, the way he taught me years ago. One drawer for property, one for accounts, one for health decisions. Nothing loose, nothing assumed. When we finished, he closed the final folder and gave a small nod. "You've locked the doors that needed locking," he said. I understood the meaning beneath it. As the days went on, I found myself thinking less about what happened and more about what had allowed it. Age didn't weaken me. Age sharpened me. But trust quiet, unquestioned trust opens cracks that others can step through if they choose to. I had always believed love would be enough to keep family aligned. I learned instead that love needs boundaries just as much as strangers do. A man's years don't make him vulnerable. It's who he believes without hesitation that can put him at risk. I didn't turn these thoughts into speeches. I didn't turn them into lessons for anyone else. But I made small notes in the journal I kept by the nightstand. Not warnings, reminders. Read everything. Move slowly when someone pushes fast. Ask why when something feels rushed. These ideas didn't come from fear. They came from clarity, earned through the quiet fracture of trust. My routines came back in steady steps. I woke early again, brewed my coffee the way I always had, and walked the yard as the sun stretched across the fence line. I repaired the loose board near the garden, cleaned the tools in the shed, and opened the windows on warm mornings. The house felt like mine again. Not borrowed, not watched, not taken for granted. Independence at my age isn't loud. It's a quiet strength that fills the small moments of the day. I made a point to see Mrs. Crane one afternoon. She invited me to sit on her porch where she poured iced tea without asking if I wanted any. She knew I always did. We talked about ordinary things, the neighbor's new dog, the weather, her plans to repaint the shutters. She never pried about the case. She didn't need to. Her presence itself was enough. Some people show you loyalty not by words, but by the steadiness they bring when you're standing in uncertain ground. My attorney joined me for lunch a week later. He didn't bring paperwork or question, just a calm conversation about the changes he'd seen in town and the clients who reminded him why he still practiced, even after retirement. When we finished eating, he placed a hand on my shoulder in quiet reassurance before leaving. Not pity, not comfort, just respect. The kind built between people who have faced storms together. As I locked the door that evening, the house felt safe, still, and fully mine again. The betrayal had settled into the past like a bruise fading under the skin, no longer painful, just understood. I turned off the lights and whispered the truth that had carried me through the hardest parts of it. Growing old isn't the danger. Trusting the wrong people is.